Welcome, everyone. Thanks for showing up on this rainy day. I think it's kind of very appropriate, given what we're about to talk about. And to those of you that are watching from your desks across Washington or wherever you are, welcome as well. So I'm Karthikeya Singh. I'm the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies here. One of the things that I lead is our States Initiative, and that's why we're pleased to host our guest today, and I'll get into a little bit more about what our States Initiative does. But first, I do have to make a security announcement, as is custom here at CSIS. In the case of an emergency, you will follow me and my colleagues out of the building, into the rain, and into the safe area that we have near National Geographic. That's only if we have an emergency, and I don't anticipate that we will. But now that that's out of the way, the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies has really been pioneering U.S. strategy for engagement with India's states. And it's been doing this through a variety of mechanisms. First, by shedding more light onto what kinds of policies and regulations are coming out of Indian states. Transparency is important to engagement with India. The other is coordinating amongst U.S. stakeholders. And the final bit is really engaging with Indian states through the formation of new processes of engagement and new models for engagement, predominantly in the energy and healthcare space, but water is an area that we're watching very closely. So why water? You know, water is a key ingredient not only for life, but also an important ingredient for economic growth. And nowhere is this more relevant than in the Indian subcontinent. And if you attended the Asia forecast that my colleagues and I participated in a few weeks ago, in my remarks, it was fascinating to see the audience reactions and guesses as to which country to expect high levels of economic growth in the coming year. But one thing that I did flag is that what most people don't understand is that the Indian monsoon does drive the Indian economy. So the other finance minister of India really is the monsoons. And India is a water-scarce nation, so the monsoons really do matter to the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people and for the ability for India to push forward its own development agenda. Climate change, in addition to excessive pollution and contamination of water, is exacerbating the scarcity of water use in India and fueling conflicts. There's already a high extraction rate of water. I think something like 91% of total water withdrawals in India are for irrigation. And there's high level of inefficiency in its use and withdrawal as well. So this complicates matters. And it's important then to understand how a country like India has set up frameworks for managing potential water conflicts and the types of powers and responsibilities it has delegated at the state and local level in order to do so. This is important to understand because there are water conflicts that are arising around the world. And from a bilateral perspective, for the United States, India lies kind of smack in the middle of its Indo-Pacific strategy. And to have a strong partner in the Indo-Pacific, we need to have a country that is economically strong and isn't crippled by the consequences of interstate water conflicts. And to unpack that and more, I am very pleased to welcome here today Dr. Scott Moore, who is a senior fellow at the Water Center and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And he'll be talking about his recent book, The Subnational Hydropolitics: Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins, to explore some of the causes of India's many interstate water disputes and what they say about the state of India's federal system. This is going to be this is a sort of intimate gathering in terms of being able to ask questions. So I encourage you to ask them as they arise, or we will certainly have a Q&A session towards the end. But I'm going to hand the floor over to Scott. Welcome once again.
Thank you so much, Karthik. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Karthik and I first met about a decade ago as youth delegates to, I believe it was the 2007 UN Climate Conference. I wish a little bit more had gotten done at that conference and subsequently, but some good friendships did come out of it. So right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you here today at CSIS. I do want to talk about some research that I've done for my recent book, but I want to tell you before I get into that, why. My book is an academic book. It's written primarily sort of from an academic point of view. But I wrote it because I think the issue of water and how we deal with it, how we manage it, is far from an academic question. It's an immensely practical one, and that's nowhere true, or as true as in the case of the Indian subcontinent and India in particular. That's for two reasons, as Kartikeya alluded to. First of all, because when we hear about kind of the water crisis globally, and particularly dealing with shortages of water or pressures related to water scarcity, from an economic point of view, those pressures are probably most pressing and most economically damaging in the case of India because of the way that it uses its water, and as Kartik mentioned, primarily for irrigation and the importance of the agricultural kind of sector to the Indian economy. The second reason is because India is a little bit unique. This is also somewhat true of Pakistan, but particularly the case in India, to which water is an intensely political and an intensely sectional issue, meaning that the kind of fault lines that separate Indian politics in terms of different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups are kind of mapped onto water, and water has come to magnify those tensions. And what that means in turn is that water is one of the preeminent, I would say, fault lines in Indian politics today, and I think it's a pretty underestimated potential risk to India's rise as a significant regional power. So I would go so far as to say, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, that if you care about things like, as Kartikeya mentioned, the free and open Indo-Pacific, you should care about water in India and how India uses its water. So with that, I'll go through a couple of slides here. And Kartik, is it all right if I stand, or is that going to mess up the frame here? Okay.
Right?
All right.
Stand.
Great. Well, let's see here. Great. So as I mentioned, the remarks I'll be giving today do come from a recent book that came out this past summer, Oxford University Press. And in that, I try to look globally at an issue that I became really interested in over the last couple of years, which is conflict over water that happens at the subnational level between states, provinces, social groups, communities within countries. And the reason that I became so interested in that is that, as I'll come back to in a second, most of the time when you think about or hear about conflict over water, people refer to it as a risk for warfare or some type of violent conflict between countries. But actually that's pretty rare, and most of the time when we see different types of conflict over water happens within countries, and yet we know very little about kind of how, why, and when that happens. And so the purpose of the book was really to try to explore some of those questions and issues. But just to kind of take a step back and say why care about that issue kind of more generally, well, the motivation is really climate change and these enormous changes in the distribution and availability of water that we're seeing around the world. What this graphic here shows you is an aggregation of about a decade's worth of observations from a satellite called GRACE. And what this satellite enables us to do is look at large-scale fluxes of water. So when you have depletion or accumulation at pretty large regional scales. So the scale of a river basin or a kind of pretty large area, roughly 100,000 square kilometer scale. And this is pretty much the first time in history that we've been able to look at these types of changes at that scale. Before that, we would have to aggregate lots of really small measurements from stream flow gauges and things like that to really get a sense of what's happening to the world's water supplies at a big scale. This satellite totally changes the game. And what it shows us is that there are tremendous regional changes in the distribution and availability of water. You can see in the Indian subcontinent, the major kind of signal that you see is actually from groundwater. In the northern part, you see large-scale depletion, and in the peninsular India, you see a little bit more accumulation over this roughly 10-year time scale. But suffice it to say, we're seeing these enormous changes in water availability and distribution across most of the world. So I'm a political scientist. I'm interested in thinking about, well, what are the implications of those types of changes? And if you kind of dig into the literature and sort of the policy debate on water, you immediately come to this idea that these changes are going to lead to an increase in sort of conflict, or that water, these changes in water distribution and availability are going to sort of somehow trigger fighting or other forms of conflict over it. And you can sort of take your pick of prominent individuals who have kind of made these types of statements. Maybe most famous to India watchers or most well-known is gentleman Brahmachalani, who wrote a book a few years ago called Water, Asia's New Battleground, in which he sort of makes the allegation that China is trying to control the major Asian rivers by building lots of dams and things like that, and makes the assertion that this is kind of the new front for great power conflict in Asia. So the only problem is that empirically, the evidence that we have doesn't really back up this idea. So if we look kind of historically, there was a study done back in 2010 that essentially tried to quantify all the instances we know about in modern history since around 1948, where there has been some type of interstate, meaning between two countries, interaction over water. So that could be a negotiation, it could be some type of agreement, it could be a rhetorical kind of battle of words. And so you get somewhere around 6,500 total events. Less than 30, about 27, actually involved any sort of violence whatsoever, or really kind of conflict beyond rhetorical conflict. And over roughly the same period, you had about 200 international water agreements signed. So actually, if you kind of look at the statistics, if anything, it seems like cooperation is becoming more common than water conflict, at least between countries. But then if we sort of look at the subnational level, we see, at least anecdotally, the complete opposite picture. And we don't have good data, by the way, on whether how often conflicts do occur between subnational groups or entities. But certainly if we kind of take a little tour around the world, there are good anecdotal examples in pretty much every major country that you can think of. Here in the US, we have long-running interstate disputes in the Colorado River Basin, the ACF Basin, Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin in the southeast US, the Rio Grande, Australia, the well-known sort of example of the Murray-Darling Basin. And in India, pretty much every major river basin is subject to a long-running interstate or interjurisdictional dispute. And that's really why I started to kind of zero in on India as this interesting case of why do we see so much subnational conflict over water. And if you're interested in trying to examine that issue globally, you have to explain it in the case of India and why it arises there. And just to sort of highlight the fact that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that while we don't have really very many good examples of water wars between countries, what we do sort of seem to see from the anecdotal evidence is that there's something of an inverse relationship between the scale of governance and how often we see conflict. So more conflict at the subnational than international level. Okay, so zooming into India. As I mentioned, you can pretty much take any major river in India and map it to at least one fairly long-running interjurisdictional or interstate dispute. The Krishna Basin, which is the case I look at most intensely in the book, actually started, the dispute actually arose during the British Raj era in the late 1890s, has persisted all the way to the present. But again, you can take pretty much every major watershed and there will be some example. I love this particular example. This was a case that arose a couple years ago where the police in Kerala claimed to have uncovered a spy who had burrowed his way into the Water Resources Department of the state of Kerala on behalf of the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu in order to gather intelligence to pass back to the state government of Tamil Nadu. That case, by the way, was subsequently slightly debunked, but I think it's a pretty good example of the kind of degree of contentiousness and acrimony that water issues have kind of captured in most cases in India. But the thing that I think makes water disputes and water conflict in India even more kind of interesting, and the thing that I ended up focusing most on in the book, is that it's really become linked to these issues of identity and identity politics. And there was an editorial in the Hindu a couple years ago that I think really pretty much captured this. It's talking about the Kaveri River Basin in peninsular India. But it says, that dispute's turning out to be less about water and irrigation and more about linguistic chauvinism and regional identity. And my research really bears out that claim, that even though there are major changes in how water is used in India, how much water is available, that do kind of underlie some of these disputes, fundamentally the reason that they become disputes and conflicts and persist over time is because they become linked to these issues of identity. And that's really what drives this conflict over time. So turning back to the case I look at most closely in the book, that's the case of the Krishna River Basin in peninsular India. Now there's something you have to, that it's important to kind of pause and note about the case of the Krishna. This would also be the case for the Kaveri and many of the peninsular rivers, but there's an important kind of historical geography aspect to this. So you've got essentially a very large kind of highland catchment area, and then the river empties over here into the Bay of Bengal. During the British imperial era, what you tended to see as a pattern of governance was that the British would settle and directly rule the coastal areas. They would more intensely develop these areas, so even today you see concentration in terms of irrigation, and certainly major urban centers really sit in this kind of coastal plain area. And the interior would be ruled by, or under the jurisdiction of so-called princely states. So they were indirectly ruled. They were under Indian native administration, but sort of nested in the British imperial system. And that kind of basic divide, so both in terms of the political history as well as the structure of water use, really persists today. So in the Krishna, the lowland kind of areas have the vast majority of the irrigation infrastructure, whereas the upland areas tend to have much less irrigation water demand. In addition to that, a lot of the major urban water use tends to be clustered kind of on the coastal plain. And that basic divide between coastal and inland, between what was historically directly ruled by the British and under native administration, basically has persisted, and kind of you can see the contours of that in the dispute to date. So I take a look in the book at the kind of case of the Krishna dating from around 1892 or so to the present. I wouldn't expect you to necessarily read all of these kind of markers and developments, but essentially the kind of thrust that you see across all of that time is when you first had the origins of a dispute, and the first kind of evidence of it is a letter from, at the time, the British resident engineer who was in charge of developing irrigation to the imperial government, saying we need to do something about water use in the upstream princely state of Mysore because they're diverting too much water. We need more of it for irrigation. It was very much a kind of elite issue. So this was to the extent that there were disputes over water use, it was really kind of an issue for hydrologists, engineers to deal with. And what we see over the course of all the way from 1890 or so to the present is it becomes increasingly politicized. It enters the popular domain. And that's really especially the case after the 1970s, and you get this boom in state-based regional parties. So for the first couple of decades after independence, of course, most parts of India are politically dominated by the Congress Party, big national, kind of big tent party. And then after the 1970s, you start to see these kind of more regional state-based parties come up that really draw their allegiance, their support from mostly common linguistic groups within individual states. And that's really when you start to see water become really politicized. People start to kind of say, water is being used by this group and kind of being stolen from another, et cetera, et cetera. And you sort of start to see it then become an issue in kind of the national parliamentary debates and discussions as well as a favorite attention of the media, which I'll get to in a second. So how does this happen? Why do we see this kind of trend and this massive increase in sort of conflict and contentiousness over water in India? Well, the first reason is that water kind of fits in this weird sort of gray zone in terms of powers and responsibilities that are given by the Indian Constitution. As many of you know, or all of you know perhaps, India is a federal system. And the thing about federal systems is you have to generally say pretty clearly what the central government can do, what the state governments can do, and what local or other subnational governments can do. And what the Indian Constitution says is that the central government does have the power to kind of deal with any dispute or complaint over water. It can also regulate the development of interstate rivers. And by the way, just to sort of, as something I think is really interesting, the framers of the Indian Constitution really they were really concerned with this issue of how you're going to divvy up water between states, because it was something that they had dealt with under the British Raj, even going back to that 1892 letter. There were these disputes over water between the princely states and the British-administered jurisdictions. So it was definitely an issue that was in the minds of the framers of the Indian Constitution in a way that, for example, it was certainly not, in the minds of the U.S. constitutional framers. So there are powers; they're just incomplete. So all that having been said, water does kind of exist in this sort of incomplete sort of area in terms of the Indian Constitution, and you can see that in the number of kind of reports that have been issued over the last couple of decades. So as India became independent in 1947. So 1955 already there was a commission saying that the powers that we have so far don't appear to confer on the central government adequate powers to deal with water resource issues. Then you go to 1988, not much has changed. Commission on Center-State Relations still says we need some kind of legal reform to deal with this problem and this continued issue of disputes. But then, as we kind of move again, sort of after the 1970s or so, you start seeing a lot of indications that there is this kind of issue of water being linked to identity and identity politics. And you start to see this kind of show up in a couple of cases. And it's worth kind of pausing here to say there's this fascinating moment that occurs in Indian constitutional history in mid-1950s. So when India becomes independent, the boundaries of the states basically reflect the boundaries of jurisdictions under the British Raj. And in the mid-1950s, the central government appoints this Commission for States Reorganization Commission, that tries to say, well, maybe we should think about redrawing state boundaries. And so they consider a number of different possible ways to do that, different bases for redrawing the state boundaries. And one of the ones that they consider is the boundaries of river basins and the distribution of natural resources within India. And they think, well, maybe this would be a good way to promote regional economic development. We have some evidence that Nehru favored this kind of approach. But then in the end, they say, well, but we really think the states, at the end of the day, they have to have a minimum degree of homogeneity, especially in terms of language. And they go with, they choose to draw the state boundaries around linguistic boundaries. So basically, you kind of codify linguistic divisions and to a large extent kind of ethnic divisions as well. So you kind of end up with this strong sense of state-based identity, which may be good for making politics a little easier within states, but it had the very unfortunate effect of making it much harder to deal with interstate issues. And that's really what we see in the case of these interstate river disputes going forward. And then you see this in the late 1960s already. There's a commission report that talks about the fact that you have the disappearance of this phenomenon of uniparty control, meaning Congress, and the rise of these state-based parties as a reason that water issues remain so vexing. So the third issue, and the one that I think maybe is most kind of interesting or important, particularly today, is the fact that you've historically seen pretty limited involvement by the civil society sector in water management issues in India. It's been until pretty recently, either an issue that sort of technical experts have really predominated in, or politicians. And you really haven't seen, and political constituencies, like farmers and things like that. So you really haven't seen, until very, very recently in most parts of India, very sustained and capable involvement of civil society actors. Yet when you do, you see a really, really profound shift in the discourse and attention. So it's not just an issue of one state versus another, one ethno-linguistic group versus another. It becomes a case of thinking about what do we need to do for the river as a whole to manage this water effectively, to deal with challenges like environment, equity in water allocation, and all those types of issues. So what does this kind of mean for India? How is it kind of affected politics? Well, basically, it's kind of unfolded in three stages where water has become increasingly weaponized as a means of kind of protest and a way to try to sort of mobilize support by localized political parties, really to the total detriment of regional interests and the interests of good water management in India. So these are a couple of quotations from, and you can see this kind of trend even just over the last 15, 20 years. These are quotations from the early 2000s, where you start to see politicians in different states sort of try to blame one party over another for failures in kind of using and allocating water effectively. But then by the time you get to a few years ago, when the state of Telangana split from Andhra Pradesh, you start to see this language really become kind of very polarized and kind of almost making one state the enemy of the other. You see the Telangana chief minister, for example, alleging that Andhra Pradesh, the former parent state, had taken a vow to destroy farmers in Telangana because it opposed giving Telangana more water under an interstate agreement. You see these kind of issues, this sort of exhortation, I suppose, by the Telangana irrigation minister. Now has come the time for Telangana to fight for its rights as the region with the largest area of catchment for the Krishna River Basin. So you see this kind of real increase in the heatedness of the rhetoric. Then by the time you get to 2016, just a couple of years ago, water has really become a firm political weapon in the hands of particular political constituencies who know that they can raise the kind of profile of their agenda by taking a dramatic stand over water. So this is the Knot Canal, which is an important part of Delhi's water supply. It was taken over for about a week by members of a caste group called the Jat, and they were protesting certain central government policies, but they literally took it over and caused some pretty significant damage to it. In the end, the Indian Army actually had to be deployed to retake the canal. If we were talking about on the international level, this would be something that people would probably point to as an incidence of warfare over water. And yet we don't see that on the international level. We see it on the subnational level within India. So what can we do? Well, strangely enough, or interestingly enough, I suppose, pretty much all elements of what I think the solution to these problems have already been proposed. They just haven't been implemented or really kind of pushed by anyone in particular. But I think the first piece of trying to deal with these issues tries to tackle that kind of constitutional question, clarifying the powers and responsibilities over water. So there has been a proposal in place for the last couple of years to move water to what's called the Concurrent List. So right now, water is sort of predominantly on the state list with only a couple select responsibilities, those ones over like development of interstate rivers being part of what's called the Union List, or exclusive federal government powers. So moving it to the Concurrent List would theoretically give the union government more constitutional leeway to deal with water management issues. The second kind of piece of this, judicial reform. So I skipped over this a little bit, but union government does have the power to appoint tribunals, which are panels of judges to try to adjudicate interstate disputes when they occur. Those have been almost completely ineffective They've usually taken decades to reach an award or to give an award when they have given an award at all. And in essentially no case have those awards proven definitive. In other words, the disputes have kind of persisted in one way or another despite tribunal judgments being rendered where in fact they have been rendered. So another kind of proposal here, which I think is a good one, is to create a single specialized tribunal for dealing with these interstate water disputes. There are enough of them that tribunal would be kept pretty busy. And the idea here is that judges would have particular expertise in dealing with water issues. It would have a fixed timeline to give awards, that sort of thing. And I do think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And then third and finally, and I think most importantly, there's this idea to create river basin management authorities through something called the River Basin Management Bill. And the idea here is you would create kind of commissions or committees for each major interstate river that would have chief ministers represented at one level, and then you would have kind of a broader set of constituencies represented at another level. This is something that if you look at other cases around the world has proven really effective as a way of trying to deal with interstate disputes, because it sort of provides a standing forum that allows water issues to be taken outside this kind of realm of partisan politics and identity politics and into one where there's a little bit more freedom and space and scope for agreement and discussion. But having said all that, all of these proposals have been on the table in most cases for at least a year, 18 months. We've seen essentially no movement on any of them, and most of them remain very deeply contentious. So this is just a couple months ago, Tamil Nadu government expressed pretty firm opposition to this idea of the river management bill. So all of these potential reforms remain very much in doubt as to whether they're going to happen. So just in closing, I'd point out that even though I've talked almost entirely about what's happening within India, the implications of these types of conflicts and disputes within India aren't limited just within India's borders. As many of you probably know, India has had a treaty since very shortly after partition with Pakistan to divide essentially the waters of the Indus River Basin. That has survived 3 wars between India and Pakistan. It's generally viewed as one of the world's most durable and in many ways successful water agreements. Subnational politics might be the thing that finally breaks that. This is Arminder Singh, some of you may be familiar with, Chief Minister in Punjab. He, over the last couple of years, has made the form of the agreement on the Indian side in terms of how it deals with the tributaries of the Indus on the Indian side. Major political issue. Every couple of months, he holds a rally, holds a press conference, saying that this division of water is totally unfair. It takes water away from Punjabi farmers, channels it into Pakistan, and the Indian government needs to either renegotiate this or give up the agreement. Few echoes to some dynamics you hear here in the U.S. also, but in that sense. But these issues and these kind of political fault lines within India do have international implications. And so even though I think this is something that from a political point of view can sort of potentially hold back India's rise to a regional power in terms of domestic politics, it's also something that can undermine the subcontinent's, I think, geopolitical stability and dynamics as well. So I will stop there and look forward to some discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Scott. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as host here to ask a few questions, and then we'll certainly open it up. It's interesting that you mentioned Punjab and its impact on relations and testing of the Indus Water Treaty. One of the bright spots in India's sort of bilateral relationships in the neighborhood has been the relationship it has cultivated with Bangladesh, resolving border disputes and what have you, and strengthening economic and infrastructure linkages. One of the outstanding issues that seems to continue to come up is the sharing of the Teesta water, which I know that the two parties are looking into. So it's interesting how subnational water conflicts can sort of have an impact on India's relations with its neighbors. I want to read a couple of excerpts from your chapter on India that might lay the ground for some interesting questions and some of the solutions that you proposed. Because you did mention institutions, new institutions, judicial reforms, that might lead to a new sort of tribunal that deals with these kinds of issues. So one of the things that I noticed is that there's no shortage of institutions, right? And when it comes to things like tribunals, you say that basically states deliberately pursue only weaker forms of collective action to maximize access to federal financing while minimizing threats to their autonomy. And a previous, institutions that I think since the 50s had been, or maybe it was 1976, yes, the River Boards Act, to really look at the development of the entire river basin, was crippled essentially by the states themselves, faced with such difficulties in obtaining water use data that the Central Water and Power Commission basically abandoned its attempts to craft comprehensive river basin development plans as early as the 1950s. Later on you cite that other officials said that some data is not published at all. And one of the things that we really work on here is transparency on state-level policies and regulations that come out of all of these states. And we do find that finding data is often very difficult. As we're tracking some of the state-level policies on renewable energy targets, I think there can be discrepancies between state and central data. And so it's interesting how this persists throughout. So when you suggest new institutions, I'm most intrigued by whether or not there's any scope for this sort of third-party, non-governmental organizations to resolve the issue. I'm sure it's been discussed. I know that I've floated with you the idea of sort of international cooperation in this space, perhaps a Colorado to Krishna water dialogue. Because you do provide such strong linkages between what's happening in the Colorado River Basin and what's happening in the Krishna River Basin, aside from the sort of sectional cleavages and the ethno-linguistic issue, which really exacerbates this problem. Do you think that there's scope for something like that, where from a bilateral perspective, we can understand and bring together stakeholders from these two river basins with the right resources and right sort of mentality in how you resolve these to actually resolve this issue?
Yeah, I think it's a really kind of interesting way to, I think it is a really kind of good way to think about potential cooperation between the U.S. And India. I mean, something that really interested me in this topic from the beginning was just looking around the world and seeing how similar a lot of these issues are and kind of how similar the political dynamics are around the world. So I think there would be a lot of scope for some type of knowledge sharing activities between the U.S. and India, how we try to deal with these issues. And in many ways, the similarities, obviously there are lots of differences, but India also has a common law system, so a lot of these kind of disputes take place through the courts, just as they do here in the U.S. So there are more similarities between those two countries than there would be between the U.S. and Brazil or something like that. By the way, I also looked at China in this book, because that's a country I've focused on quite a bit in some of my previous work. And I think the really interesting, maybe one of the more interesting things from my point of view as a political scientist, that looking at this water issue kind of helps to show is how it almost doesn't matter what kind of form of government you have, whether it's authoritarian, federal, whatever. Subnational and local officials can be really good at finding ways to do whatever they want to do, despite whatever kind of laws, regulations, powers a central government has. That may sound a little simplistic, but it has a lot of, I think, take pretty much any policy issue, any political debate, and I think it has a really important set of implications, because a lot of times when we look at why there are laws on the books, but there's a huge difference between that and what happens sort of on the ground, I think a lot of it has to do with this fact that local officials in pretty much every country context, they have their own interests they want to pursue, things they want to do that are not what the law, federal or central government laws say that they should do, and they find ways to do it. And I think that divergence actually explains quite a lot that we see in terms of less than ideal outcomes or poorer than expected outcomes. So I think there would be a tremendous amount of value to what you described, and I think in India, particularly focus on data, just trying to get that aggregated and in a format where it's useful would be a very powerful tool. And thanks to sort of platforms like Satellite Grace I mentioned at the outset, we have the data now to do it that we didn't necessarily in the past.
Great. All right, I am going to throw it open to questions, and I do believe that you, sir, had one. We have my colleagues with a microphone here to assist.
Tom Timberg, consultant. I would like to thank you. I'll read the book now, and for your talk, and Dr. Singh's additions, which I think were very useful. But I wonder, the dangerous thing is you ask questions about what you didn't talk about. There is the Damodar Valley development, which was an attempt to have such a thing. I think there's a somewhat similar one on the Tungabhadra, though that one there have been other issues with. And insane. Damodar Valley, I remember, was to some extent modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority, talking about, what has been the experience with them? What's the likelihood that, as you say, your solution 3 will work?
Yeah, great. Yeah, Scott, you did mention the Damodar Valley Corporation, and I have heard of linkages to the Tennessee Valley Authority before. So if you want to talk a little bit about sort of what's happening.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's the other part of the India portion of the book that I didn't. So thanks for giving the opportunity to chat a little bit about it. So this was I mentioned this kind of specific constitutional power to regulate development of interstate river valleys. That was really kind of from this idea that Nehru and some of the other leaders of the kind of Indian independence movement and kind of constitutional architects had. They had this sort of very kind of statist idea of how you do economic development. They had this idea that you want to sort of take a region with rich natural resources and develop an economy around it, using the resources that are there to build up industry and kind of cities and everything else from there. That is essentially the exact same approach that we followed here in the US with Tennessee Valley Authority, and that's probably globally the most prominent model of that idea. You take an area that maybe historically has been underdeveloped but has rich natural resources, and you build on those to raise its level of development in a very, according to a very kind of strong centrally directed plan, and through a kind of state-sponsored body, through a public organization of some kind. So this idea was really kind of popular among the leaders, Indian independence kind of movement, and so they decided to create an Indian version of that in the form of this Damodar Valley Corporation. And the idea was it would be a state-owned entity, essentially, that would be responsible for doing hydroelectric power generation, flood control, erosion control, again, very similar to what Tennessee Valley Authority originally was set up to do. And the idea was that it would be governed by a board with representatives of the states and that kind of share this. And it's a kind of small tributary of the Ganges, and so the states that share this kind of watershed would be represented. What you saw, though, over the next couple of decades, was founded in 1948. The state governments comprehensively took over management of the corporation. They fought over things like where the headquarters would be, how many employees would be Biharis versus Bengalis. And it is completely hamstrung operation of the corporation. So it still exists. It basically is just a glorified hydropower utility. It really doesn't do anything in terms of management or governance. So it kind of never lived up to its ambition. And the way that I kind of portray that in the book is that it very quickly kind of became captured by state politics. So that even though it was a good example of an attempt by the Union government to develop a river basin in this kind of regional approach instead of a more haphazard approach, that it didn't work. And then in some ways it's the best example of how state politics kind of unless you have strong central government leadership, how state politics kind of takes over these issues. And by the way, that was essentially what happened to the TVA as well.
Other questions? Yes, one there and one back there. Two in the back row.
We haven't talked about the massive inefficiencies in the water in India and the implications of that. I mean, you've got 40 to 60% of the urban water being lost. You've got groundwater going down by a meter per year in Bangalore and Gurgaon. And then you've got a completely, well, let's say, disorganized irrigation system. Are any of the states starting to address these issues in a more, I mean, as you say, there's a lack of data, but has anybody sort of been a leader in this area of trying to make more sense of the efficient use of water within the state? Secondly, I think the other issue is, yes, there's interstate, but within states, there's massive disagreement as well, because obviously the farmers and the urban, and there have been cases where, I can think of one in particular, a chief minister lost an election because during a drought, the farmers didn't get enough water and the urban centers did. So it's very much within states as well as a major issue of conflict.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll answer that one and then we'll go to the next one.
Sure, yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, yeah, great points. No, I mean, there's not really, I would say, a state that's doing irrigation efficiency improvements very well. There's some individual kind of promising projects. I used to be at the World Bank, and we had a couple of projects that showed some significant promise in UP, in Odisha, and there are a couple of other states as well where we have these sort of pilot projects that appeared to reduce irrigation water use through improved efficiency, at least over the short run. But to my knowledge, you can't really say that that's happening very widely across a particular state. I would say, though, that even if you were to get, and you're absolutely right that really inefficient water use is a big part of this problem, but I really don't think that would solve the kind of issue of water conflict or the sort of politics around water. I do think that's fundamentally a political kind of problem. It's a response to incentives, but it is a choice by politicians, particularly state-level politicians, to kind of use this, particularly the allegation that another state or another group is stealing your water to mobilize their constituencies. I mean, that works because most of them happen to be farmers, so I mean, it's logical. But it is kind of a choice, I think, to use that as kind of a fault line to mobilize supporters. And I don't think that issue would change if you had better irrigation water use efficiency necessarily. As a quick side point on that, we do see globally that improved efficiency actually pretty rarely leads to actual decreases in water consumption, as an interesting kind of side note. So there's this phenomenon that is often called the boomerang effect. So where you have more capacity for use of any given resource, you tend to respond as an economic, for economic reasons by using more of it. One very clear example tends to be when state governments here in the U.S. add more lanes to a road. Congestion doesn't ease. More people drive more often. So you actually end up having as worse or as bad or worse an issue. So just as a side note, it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not necessarily a solution either to the water or the political issues.
I'm gonna.
There's not a big jump in consumption into economic status, which is right. In urban India, for example, there's not as significant. It's really quite outstanding that the rich are using as much water as the poor. There's a very minimum use. Water's not being wasted by the consumer in India. It's being wasted by the institutions that are managing it.
Let me add
point.
a little bit to the question that was asked here. So when we're looking at urban India and water use, yes, there's a very serious problem. You're talking about these gel boards that are at the urban level that are responsible for distributing water, and there is politics at the urban level of tankers going into neighborhoods and black market of how much money you have to pay to get water illegally versus institutions like nice five-star hotels, maybe not paying at the appropriate slab level. But one of the ways that I think civil society and government has really mobilized around increasing water access in urban areas is sort of an age-old, ancient Indian technology of rainwater harvesting, right? And one state that I do recall sort of created a law around this was Tamil Nadu. That was several years ago. Now, enforcement of new real estate and other development having requirements for rainwater harvesting units to be installed, is the thing to really look for when sort of managing urban developed landscape and impervious, surface, and how much groundwater recharge is really happening to increase the, the water table and the capacity of urban areas to draw from below. The other thing, and this is, there's not to contradict my friend Scott, who is until recently at the World Bank, and of course they're doing very interesting analysis looking at, interventions that are meant to improve efficiency, but, thanks to the boomerang effect, might not be. But yeah, the central government did roll out a network of high energy efficiency irrigation pumps across the country through a quasi-government company called the Energy Efficiency Services Limited, and we're talking about tens of millions of pumps in an effort to sort of improve energy efficiency of the pumps themselves and affect the power sector. But what that's resulting in is probably increased consumption of water. So another thing that's being tried more recently, where the states are experimenting, is really turning agricultural consumers of electricity into prosumers, which is essentially give them a solar-powered microgrid to power their irrigation pump. And they will be judicious in the use of that power for irrigation versus what they can sell back and make money to the grid. Now, these are sort of experimental projects which are, states are trying out to see what not only improves the fiscal health of their state utilities, which is such a crippling problem to the state budgets and overall central government reform process, but would have major implications for water consumption. But whether or not that would alleviate, the sort of large-scale interstate water conflict issue and how deeply embedded it's been is, of course, another question. I'm going to take one more question from the gentleman on the back row here. And,
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. Excellent presentation. I'm Dave Herman from the State Department Office of Conservation and Water. So maybe I wouldn't mind just asking you to do a crystal ball exercise. And of the three solutions that you noted, which of those do you think is most likely or holds the most promise? And I guess I would just note from what you've said, it seems to me that they're not mutually exclusive, right? I mean, you could do them in combination with one another. So maybe you could comment on that a little bit too. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. Also spent a little bit of time at the State Department as a fellow, and had the opportunity a little bit to work with your office, and I really admire and respect what you do. I think it's tremendously important, so I hope more people maybe can become aware of the good work that the Office of...
Your reputation lives on it.
Well, hopefully for the better than the worse. But so I think of those three, probably the judicial reform piece is the one that I see the most likelihood of passing. I think that is something, no one is satisfied with the current kind of arrangement. The justices hate doing these cases because they're really complex. They drag on for decades. No one, there's no way to win. No matter what the kind of verdict is, you're going to be hit over the head with it. So nobody really likes that system, and the states, of course, don't think it's fair. The union government doesn't like the fact that it takes so long to render verdicts. They want these issues resolved. They want, in many cases, to be able to push out financing for irrigation infrastructure and things like that are kind of tied up in litigation. So I think no one likes it, and I think that probably has the single highest chance of passing. And you're right that they're certainly not mutually exclusive. That reminds me, by the way, there was an important part of the last question I didn't answer, which is this kind of issue of like financing for things like irrigation. When I looked at these cases across a couple different countries of subnational conflict over water, I found a lot of it was animated actually, like specific instances of conflict are actually animated mostly by competition for federal financing. So it actually had nothing to do. So if you were to correlate, for example, when court cases were filed, when you had noticeable increases in mentions in Parliament by state representatives, had nothing to do with drought, nothing to do with kind of hydrological conditions. It had everything to do with when central or federal governments were pushing out financing for water infrastructure and especially irrigation. Wow. And that's when you saw increases in actual conflict. Now, over time, those became politicized, and I think the reason that you have disputes persist has a lot to do with this kind of embroiling with identity politics, but the proximate cause is often competition for financing.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you, Scott, for coming to CSIS and sharing a little bit about your book and the India sections in particular, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict Cooperation, and the Institution Building in Shared River Basins. I learned a tremendous amount from reading the sections that I got through regarding the rich history of not only how the Indian Constitution was framed and center-state relations, but the long-lasting sort of implications for how these relations will play out, particularly in the vacuum of not having the capacity to act on behalf of the central government, and the political scenario as it's unfolding with regards to the dynamics of the rise and fall of parties in India, and of course all of it exacerbated by increased scarcity due to climatic effects, pollution, and increased just usage. So I'm hoping that one of your many solutions gets put into action, and I'm also secretly hoping that there can be lessons learned from a bilateral perspective from the Colorado and the Krishna. But I'd like you all to join me in thanking Scott for coming.
Thank you.